Good afternoon. How are you all doing? So we've got an amazing group of people here. And in a sense, there's a crisis that we are all thinking about that I think many of you are thinking about, which is the fact that the cost of drugs is rising exponentially. It's like about to reach $3 billion. And that's coming into the sort of headwinds of people thinking about drug costs, thinking about the cost of healthcare. We have a real crisis that we have to figure out ways to fix. And it's probably not going to be any single group that does it. But conveniently here we have groups that represent new entrepreneurs in biopharma, the FDA, and thinking about how we can empower clinicians to be able to make differences in this space. And so I want to start off with Daphne and ask her, especially considering Amy sitting right here, what would you want to see from the FDA? How could the FDA help you as CEO of a new biotech?
So thank you, Vijay. It's a real privilege to be here, and especially with Amy here to have this dialogue. So first, I think it's important to clarify what it is that we're talking about in terms of the increasing cost of drugs, because there is the increasing cost of drugs as the consumer sees them and what part of the overall healthcare spending that is, and then there is the cost that it takes to make a new drug. And a lot of people confound the two. I think first, just an interesting data point that I heard just a couple of days ago, which is that if one were to cut all of the profits, entirely just keep the cost of manufacturing for branded drugs, the cost of what the US pays for healthcare would go down by 2-point-something%. So this is not a huge portion of the US healthcare spending. It's something that, unfortunately, because of the way reimbursement is done, the consumer feels particularly acutely, but that's not where the bulk of the cost of US healthcare spending goes. I think the heart of the question from where I sit and where my interest, I think, and where I could potentially work towards is the exponential increase in cost of what it takes to make a new drug. And that is something that has, in fact, been growing exponentially year on year for the past 70 years. Despite all of the healthcare advancements, we have this thing called Eroom's law, which is the inverse of Moore's law, which says that every year it costs exponentially more to make a drug. At this point, the return on investment on pharma R&D is below the cost of capital and will soon hit zero. And the impact of that for everyone here in this room is, and for everyone in the world, is that that will make an investment in new drug discovery become not cost effective for people, and we will see fewer and fewer new drugs invented. So how can the ecosystem help make that trend go away? I think if you look at some of the big successes that have happened, it's in drugs that are appealing to a smaller patient population but with larger effect sizes. So that instead of looking for those mass market drugs like the next generation of statins, a lot of the drugs that we're now seeing are treating what might be called orphan populations of 2,000 or 20,000 or maybe 50,000, but not millions. And that requires that the FDA work with companies to come up with routes that make trials for those kinds of drugs more effective, whether it's by data-driven biomarkers, by innovative clinical trial designs that are basket trials that capture multiple different types of patient populations within a larger trial, or with endpoints that are more forward-looking and then are tested using real-world evidence down the line, rather than by requiring a 7-year follow-up during the clinical trial, which frankly for a lot of smaller companies especially is just not sustainable. So I think there's many of those that have already been implemented by the FDA, and I think if we have a broader framework for those, that's the place where I think we could really start getting drugs that, cost aside, actually work for people and have a meaningfully large clinical effect.
So if I take what I heard from Daphne, I heard a couple of key features. One is we need to be prioritizing as much as possible drugs that work with large effect sizes that are essentially tailored or individualized for the problem at hand. Yeah. And we also need to be taking advantage of novel mechanisms for clinical evidence generation that streamline the process with regulatory clarity about how you can use, for example, platform trials and new clinical trial solutions, how you can put real world evidence into action whenever possible, et cetera. And So, as sort of putting on my FDA hat and sort of thinking about and reflecting on that, the answer is yes, yes, and double yes. But then the next step becomes, and so what does that really mean?
Right.
And so, first of all, certainly on the drug development and discovery side, all across the community, you're already prioritizing the process of trying to individualize and tailor drugs and identify drugs that have large effect sizes. As the FDA, in order to ultimately help smooth that process, being able to make sure we clarify regulatory pathways, that's going to be particularly critical, but also to make sure at the FDA, we're prepared and ready to do the work on our side. And I think that's one of the things that as I came new to the FDA, it became really obvious to me how important that is. So that means that we need to make sure that within the FDA, we have the scientific understanding and capabilities to understand how to interpret the work that you're doing. We also have essentially the bandwidth from a regulatory review perspective to review an increasing number of applications for smaller and smaller indications. And also, given the fact that many of these now become accelerated pathways, potentially drugs get approved and now have multiple points of regulatory review after approval, we need to actually think about increasing regulatory responsibility in that way. And so, one of the things that is very obvious is that means that we have a book of work inside the agency that's increasing, and so the agency has to scale its book of work. Which takes me to my third point, which is that as the agency, we not only need to be ready to deal with the new data types that you're talking about, we actually need to have the right technical and essentially workflow infrastructure inside the agency to prepare to scale. And so one of the things that we focused on in the last couple of weeks, we even just announced this last week, is how do we build a new technical infrastructure inside the agency to prepare us to scale for the future, including how we use data differently inside the agency, how we interface with you for real-world evidence and novel clinical trial designs, and also how do we basically scale the book of work of regulatory reviewers when there are more and more individualized therapies coming down the line.
So drawing upon what Amy was emphasizing about the significance of real-world evidence and data, Premal, how can we use technology to try to make an impact into those areas?
Yeah, so what you were alluding to earlier, Amy, giving us guidelines, right, on what data is needed, how we get data, how we structure it. That's what we do, right? And what we're realizing is that the data you find in unstructured documents is messy, right? It's really, really messy. And sure, you can use humans and it works, right? But it's not entirely the most scalable thing in the world, right? It works really well, in fact. So how do we use technology? Well, we start actually right up front. So getting documents, believe it or not, is a pain in the butt. Right, there's a HIPAA right of access, which many of you know about, but it wouldn't be surprising that 50% of institutions don't even comply with that. And we came up with a patient record scorecard to grade these institutions on this. Once you get these documents, they often come in big boxes, 4,000 pages at once. So how do you deal with that, right? So you have to use, in other industries, it's considered modern technology, natural language processing, OCR. In healthcare, these are foreign concepts a lot of times. And to give you guys an example, all of our engineers, by design, don't have healthcare experience, right? So we can use technology to lift all that stuff. But what we're also finding is that pharma companies, other stakeholders in the industry want humans on the back end, right? So this notion of completely automating everything just doesn't fly, right, in healthcare. It's great in other industries, but it doesn't fly. So we like to call it human augmented automation, right? So we use technology to lift stuff. We use humans to fill in the gaps. But in that way, we see 5x, 6x, 7x scale increases to extract this meaningful data, right? And what would be helpful, when we talk to folks like Daphne and Amy are, okay, once we have all this information, and we have rich information, how do we structure it? What formats do we structure it in? What's the most valuable form, right, for the intake of that information?
Yeah. But beyond that, so if you had that data, basically what I think you're describing is a world where all the data for a given patient could be at one's fingertips. But how does that change? Why is that important?
Yeah, so it helps. Let's take the patient first, okay? Daphne was alluding to the cost of drugs, and I saw a statistic the other day, something like $285 billion or millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars are in repeat testing, for example. You give patients their data, you give them the information that they have, repeat tests go down. This is a major, major impact in the healthcare industry and increases outcomes. right? If you talk about pharma partners with whom we work, they want all the data. They want it structured in a way that they can intake it and not have to do work on it. So we believe that structuring data at scale impacts all stakeholders. Starts with a patient, because they're getting better care, and then all the intakers of that data, whether it's pharma companies, data companies, whether it's insurance companies, they like this in a structured format as well. So we think automating extraction of data, giving it to the patient, allowing them to control it is step one. But we also know that the intake of that data from various stakeholders, they want it in that format as well.
So Daphne, in terms of your role as a biotech CEO, I mean, you think about data very much as well.
All the time, yes.
Yeah, and so, what are we doing wrong today that is leading to Eroom's law, and what is that possible to even be changed?
So I think there's many things that we're doing wrong today, not least of which is the false impression that lots and lots of really bad data is somehow you're going to make up with quantity for lack of quality. And especially in the healthcare space, that can lead you astray in so many different ways that frankly will potentially cause harm to human life. So I think being really thoughtful and rigorous about data quality is, and recognizing that there needs to be an investment in data quality is really important.
So is that data cleaning, or is it what gets quality?
I think it's data cleaning. It's having a set of, as much as possible, standardized protocols that might be applied across institutions that deal with patients, so that the same data entry in one institution might mean the same thing around another institution. That's important when patients are transferring, as they often do, from one healthcare organization to the next. And it's also important when you have downstream users of that data for research purposes, whether it's companies or pharmas or such, to really make use of the data in a way that it actually makes sense. I also think coming to a different perspective on this, we do not give users, patients, an easy way to share their data with healthcare providers or with research organizations. When you go talk to actual patients, for instance, they will often tell you that they are excited about having their healthcare data be used to further the development of new treatments for their disease, whether it benefits them or whether it just benefits other patients like them later on. They actually, many of them, would like to have the opportunity to have their data be useful in this way. We do not have a place for people to click a button and say, I would like my data to be used for research purposes under the following conditions.
So Premal, don't you think that's a good idea?
100%. We think it is. It's interesting, Daphne. People want to share their data, but the one big issue is they don't have their data.
I know.
Right? That is the issue. And so what we hear from patients is
no one has their data.
Well,
it's not that they don't have their data.
We get excited about.
Interesting question. So who knows where show of hands, who knows where their healthcare data is right now?
Ooh. 3, 4.
I think these are the optimists in the crowd. I mean, the problem is that we don't know where our data is and we can't even share it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me kind of go back to the quality piece here.
Yeah.
So one is we got to figure out where our data is and share it. But ultimately, if we go to this fundamental issue that in order to make sense of data and then use it for many really high value and important purposes, like the fundamental question is, how do we make sure that the data are of adequate quality to be put to all of those uses?
Yes.
There are a couple of additional things besides basically cleaning it at scale. So there's opportunities around linkage, which goes back to this issue of knowing where your data is, because there may be different pockets of information that come together to tell your longitudinal story, or ultimately how data are going to be combined together to fill in data gaps. There's also better ways to not only curate data, whether that's by hand or with automated methods, but also use analytic techniques to fill in gaps when we have problems. And then most importantly, we actually need to basically describe data quality in a consistent fashion so that we not only know the quality of our data sets right now, but we actually can continuously benchmark as we improve on that across time. And so, one of the kind of key elements here around data quality is knowing what good looks like, and then being able to share that conversation with each other. And ultimately, as a patient who not only wants my data, but also wants to make sure that if my data is going to contribute to something meaningful in the future, I would want to know that there's some system of moving towards the right kind of meaningful system where my data.
Do you think that's the role of the FDA? I mean, because we can generate all we want, we can give to Daphne all we want, but if it's not going to be accepted by you, what difference does it make?
I think that you've hit on something that I believe is a really important question, which is where does the FDA sit in this designation of what's high quality? Certainly within the context of real-world evidence, in December of 2018, we put out the RWE framework to describe where we're going for real-world evidence. And the first part of this was data that are fit for purpose. And the follow on that for that includes being able to standardize quality in some kind of consistent fashion. My general belief is that all across the ecosystem of biomedicine and data, we should be asking this question, but FDA holds a central responsibility because so many stakeholders have aspects that have to go through the FDA. And so if we can, at FDA, start to solve for that, I think it's got relevance.
So Amy, Daphne's generating data in her process of drug design, and Premal's gathering data from patients. Given the people in the onset we have here, what can you do to be prescriptive for what the FDA would like to be, what you'd love to see made? What's missing?
So what's missing? So I think there are a number of things that are missing, but as you asked that question, I had a couple of really quick issues that came to mind. First of all, many of you are thinking about what solutions can I generate that are high value for clinicians, high value for health systems, for example. And often in developing those, you're not necessarily thinking about what data exhaust and what kind of information is also going to come out of those systems. So one thing is, as contributors to the overall ecosystem, but also as value for your individual products, thinking about the data that is generated within your product, but also then can contribute to the larger ecosystem of data in a consistent and high quality fashion, I think is one of the things that I would love to see of this community. So workflow solutions may sound like they don't necessarily have the same responsibility in drug discovery, but actually may ultimately be the solution that generates high quality data that contributes to other data sets. Similarly, I'd love to see of this community for us to start to talk more. Practically speaking, how is FDA and other parts of government and regulators speaking to the data and tech community to say, here's how we work together, here are the rules of the road, here are the problems we're seeing that need to be solved, and go after this, because not only does it seem like it's very high value, but ultimately it's very important.
What does talking more look like?
What does talking more look like? So I think that it's got a number of different features. The first is that I think as government, as regulators, you're going to see me and us continue to try and get out there more and more to say, this is an important conversation to be had. I think the second part is ultimately a number of fora, whether those are public and other kind of advisory and stakeholder meetings where we're coming together and saying, how do we work together? I think ultimately out of those, what I'd like to hear is here's what we need in order to be able to understand how to do our job well. So for example, we're starting to think about building regulatory toolkits so that whether you're a small company or anywhere of any size, you can understand how to get the tools that you need from the FDA to do your work. So tell us what you need so that we can think about how do we provide clarity as much as possible.
Yeah, and so in that spirit, Daphne, for the people that you think about partnering with, I could see you partnering with digital health companies, with existing pharma, sitting in the middle. Now, how do you think about these partnerships, and what are you looking for?
So actually, high quality data is one of the biggest things that we're looking for, because I think that there's so much insight that one can extract.
And can you be more specific? Human data, molecular, everything in between?
I think human data is probably the scarcest resource, and the one
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mean clinical data, or do you mean like patient-reported outcomes? What do you?
I actually have some of the data that I've seen suggests that even patient-reported outcomes, if collected in a good way, are actually pretty good. People often know how they're feeling frankly better than the physician when they come in for that once a year test in a very artificial environment. Yep. And I mean, people know if they have trouble climbing the stairs every day, right? So I think patient-reported outcomes versus clinical reported outcomes is not where the difference in quality lies. It's in making sure that your outcomes are well defined. It's making sure that they're recorded in the right way, that they're not in some random free text field. It's that records are linked to each other. In that even little things like knowing which assay you use to perform the test, oftentimes that's not recorded in the right way in clinical records. So I think those are where we see the biggest gaps, and is not in the patient versus clinician reported outcomes.
I'd agree.
So one of the cool things about using technology to lift information off of documents and not humans, right, is that we can do whatever we want, right? And so I think to Amy's point, I mean, the conversation needs to happen more. It's got to complete the circle, right? What do you want? What is going to be accepted, right? And what's needed to really, really propel drug making that's going to be accepted?
I think it happens. I think the problems come up before you get to the point where you're extracting data using from the documents, regardless of whether you're using people or technology to do it. It's in the fact that the data that's recorded in the documents to begin with is not recorded with all the quality safeguards, with the right set of definitions and so on.
EMR data.
Yeah. In particular, EMR data, and I,
yeah, exactly.
I think what comes with that is the need, oftentimes, to have somebody on your team has a really strong understanding of what was going on clinically as these data were being collected, so that ultimately, especially if you're looking at clinical data, EMR data that are passively collected or essentially passively extracted for the things that you're talking about, ultimately, there's a lot of features of those data sets that are a byproduct of how healthcare gets delivered, and making sure that you've got people who can help you sort of work your way through that. Let me give you a really practical example. Knowing when there's going to be cut and paste errors and being able to sort of sort through that noise becomes very important. I'm an oncologist. A lot of our details are going to be, consistent and accurately recorded on the first visit. And there's a lot of cut and paste errors on follow-ups. And so, being able to work your way through all of those different kinds of features. And I think the other thing that you're getting at, Daphne, is, not only do you have to understand how to work through the features of each of these different kinds of data sets, as you drill down further, it's not just electronic health record data, but it's individual variables like the PD-L1 expression test. We have to know all the features of how that test was done in order to interpret it.
Exactly.
In terms of all the people playing here, we've got payers, we've got providers, we've got patients, and maybe pharma. Who's incented to get Daphne the data she needs?
The patient.
I'd like to know the answer.
See, so the patient is, right? I mean, if you think about it.
But why are they? Why are
well, to Daphne's point earlier, right? Patients want to contribute to give back. I mean, especially in the cancer space, right? We've talked about incenting patients to get their data and stuff like that. We actually find there's not a lot of incentive needed, right? Cancer patients want to live, first and foremost. They want to get all their data, and if they can contribute to research and to science, they do it. As long as you make it easy for them to do it. And we make it so you just put in literally an email address, right? You hit click and it gets sent. All the information with full data provenance with all the documents, right?
But is that enough? Because, that will put what's in the EMR. I guess you have to be thoughtful for all the things Amy was talking about.
Well, yes, we do get the original documents. You got to get, obviously everything. There are patient-reported outcomes that you layer onto it. And to Amy's point, then, through seeing a lot of different things, right, you get smarter and smarter, the proverbial machine learning, right? Are there going to be outliers? Are there going to be edge cases? Absolutely, right?
Well, I'm an oncologist, so I would argue that there are going to be a lot more edge cases. I used to think of edge cases as the 10% on the side, right? But actually, it's probably more 60%. And the reason is because if I just go to my oncology clinic, which I don't have anymore, but I used to, the patients are incentivized when they're sick, they're interfacing with the clinician, et cetera. The incentives for contributing information, making sure it's complete and accurate, et cetera, changes, of course, across the life cycle of a patient, and that's just in the cancer space. So for example, oh gosh, go away. So for example, if the patient is now 5 years out and feeling well, we still care a lot about long-term outcomes, but that patient is unlikely to be going back to the clinic and doing the kind of consistent follow-up that you need. And so I think one of the kind of critical pieces here is as we work through this space of data, we need to, prioritize and work with really new and novel data sets that do bring high quality, consistent information. But we also have to acknowledge that they're, therapeutic and scenario specific, and we need to figure out how do we widen to other areas as we go along.
So I want to switch gears a little bit, and then we'll get to some questions from the audience. So let's say you're giving advice to a young or just a new tech entrepreneur, that maybe hasn't done anything in healthcare, but is very passionate about the space and wants to make an impact. What would you tell that person?
So before coming to the FDA, I worked in the health tech industry for a number of years, and I really enjoyed the energy and the passion and the spirit, but often among people for whom healthcare was new, and often their interactions with healthcare were relatively healthy interactions, not necessarily interactions of very sick patients or thinking about drug development or many of the kind of high risk scenarios that we're talking about. So ultimately, one of the things that I saw, and I would tell new tech entrepreneurs, is that the rules of the road, the way healthcare is delivered, a lot of these things are different than expected. And historically, the goals to kind of go out and find out, for example, what do regulators say, what happens within the bowels of health systems, et cetera, are not necessarily within the context of what you do as a new tech company. But I would say in healthcare, in this space where there is high risk and high reward, finding out early, how do I work within the guideposts that are already set up? How do I prioritize my work so I don't get distracted and I focus on what my clients are going to buy from me? For example, if we're talking about data curation, understanding what life science companies are going to want, so that if that's your client base, that is going to be a group who trusts what you're doing. And I think that's probably one of my biggest points of focus.
Yeah, so I think what's really important to tell a new tech entrepreneur, and for context, I spent most of my life on the tech side of the world, a computer science department at Stanford, and then in a tech company. And there's very much a mentality in the tech entrepreneurship space that you don't really need to have a lot of domain knowledge going in. It's okay to come in, figure stuff out as you go along. Maybe you break a little bit of stuff along the way, but that's okay because you can figure it out later. And maybe that's fine if you're building a dating app. But if you're doing something that is really, the lives of patients are at stake here, it's not just about learning how to work with a regulator that's important. These are people's lives at stakes, and you need to understand the domain, and it's a really complicated domain. Healthcare is really complicated with a lot of concepts and a lot of jargon and a lot of rules. Biology is at least as complicated as that. And so if you're coming into this space fresh, I would say, first of all, come in with a lot of respect. Respect for the people who are in this space that have a lot of knowledge that you don't, and listening to them and understanding that space is really important. Respect for being willing to move more cautiously and more slowly, because breaking things is not as legitimate when you're actually doing something that where people's lives are at stake as when you're building some kind of app. And just being willing to partner with experts who are outside your domain and take the time both to learn from them and to have them learn from you, and really build what we're trying to do at Insitro, which is a cross-cultural team of people who speak both languages and are able to work together as a single team without sort of the hubris of I know everything.
So previously I was at diagnostic companies, and it was cool to develop new products and things like that. What you realize in healthcare a lot of times is janitorial work. Right? Healthcare, there's a lot of janitorial work. And you talk about the auto industry, for example. You talk about, tell me about the fancy cars, Maseratis, Porsches, whatever. People don't talk about ExxonMobil, right? What does ExxonMobil do? They go out in the middle of the ocean, dig 8 miles, and get crude oil, and then go refine it. There's a lot of janitorial work in healthcare, right? You go to an oncology clinic, a community oncology clinic, where the nurse navigators are receiving 400, 500 pages of faxes from the 3rd floor when they're sitting on the 5th floor. This actually happened last week. It was a community center, big, to serve 3 million lives, but they bought an oncology practice. They were on the same EMR, okay, but different versions. So the 3rd floor would fax the referral notes to the 5th floor. And it'd be thousands of pages a day. And the poor nurse navigators, he or she would have to go through and look for that one little paragraph so they can enter it into the EMR so they can bill, right? That is healthcare, okay? We like to talk about the fancy stuff. We like to talk about high tech and all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, healthcare, so much of it is janitorial work. If you can cut minutes off people's time, that makes a big difference. And so I encourage everyone to think about not just the sexy, glamorous stuff about healthcare, and it's fun to get into, but what are the things we can do to eliminate the fax machines, the CD-ROM drives, and things like that, which name anybody who's got that in their office right now, but we have 5 of them, right? Because we get CDs when we make requests for people's images, and we have to go upload those. Okay. So that's ridiculous. So let's not always think about the cool stuff, let's think about the janitorial work.
So before we go into some questions, I want to just circle back with how we started. So we talked about this crisis, and whether it's a crisis in terms of the fraction of US healthcare, from an investment point of view, ROI is something investors care about, and it'll be a crisis one way or the other. So I didn't think we were going to solve it in 30 minutes or so, but I think we've got to some ideas. So one of the things we've talked about is that we've talked about generation of data, whether it be in terms of pharma generation data or gathering of data and the significance of data. But all the things we've talked about, are any of these things really going to be the key things, or are there technologies yet to come that will be what's missing?
So I'm going to start, and just to kind of get this part going. I think the one thing that we sort of worked our way around was the value and the ability of data to be able to be used for multiple purposes simultaneously. And as Daphne pointed out in the very beginning, in this crisis of healthcare and the crisis of cost, only a small piece of it is really drug costs, but all of it is how the system operates overall. And as Premal was saying, there are all kinds of aspects of the system to be optimized. And one of the opportunities that we have is to not only to get to high quality structured data that can be put to many uses, but that those uses can live on the drug development and drug discovery side simultaneous to the healthcare optimization and improvement side. And I think part of our task is to basically get to the point of the basic platform of data that we can trust and then learn as quickly as possible how to solve questions and problems across the space to bring the cost down.
Right.
So,
any other parting
go ahead.
No, I just think to Amy's point, it's going to take everything, right? There's no silver bullet in healthcare, right? If you think that where there's going to be one technology, one company doing something like that, that's insane to think about. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier. There's a lot of things you can do that will move the needle. They might not be the most glamorous things, but technology will help, right? And I don't want to also lose sight of the patient, right? We always talk about doing this and moving data here. I always sort of draw the picture that, if you think about HIPAA, right? HIPAA was developed because people want to move data. But historically what's happened is that people will move data around the circle, right? So this company will sign a BA with this company and put it here, right? The technology, if you will, is going through the middle, which is the patient, right? You put the patient in the middle, give them data, empower them to do what they want. That's a big leap forward, which is crazy to think about that hasn't happened yet. But in my mind, that's a technological advance, is to give patients the ability to control their data and do what they want.
So I think this notion of having a thread that runs through the entire process in which there is an alignment of incentives that speaks to the collection of data in a rigorous form, the ability to give patients control over that data, and then feeding that data back into the R&D cycle so that new drugs can be developed that help the patients. I think creating some mechanism by which incentives are aligned, and maybe that can be, Medicare Advantage or something, or maybe some of the larger consolidated healthcare systems, and really driving home the fact that having a unifying thread of data that feeds throughout this process is going to really be a transformative force in allowing new drugs to be created, the right drugs to reach the right patients so that they actually have effects that are clinically meaningful. I think creating that type of ecosystem is going to be an incredibly powerful thing. And maybe that tying thread is, in fact, giving the patient control over their own medical records. Or maybe it's just creating that mindset among the organizations that have enough patient records that it really makes a difference. But I think that's what it's going to take to really transform this.
Can I add one piece? So if we, aligning incentives, focusing on the patient, thinking about how do we use data smartly to simultaneously improve healthcare delivery, and and discovery, I think all are really where we see the space going. But then fundamentally, we have to sort of back up and say, and so what am I going to focus on now in my organization or the places that I have my span of influence? And I think one of the things I think about all the time is like how then, within the context of where I'm responsible, how do I push that forward? And so, I think for each of us thinking about from where we focus, can we most contribute to that story is part of the task. I mean, certainly at FDA, what I've been focusing on is how do I make sure FDA is appropriately prepared and can contribute? And I think each of us are trying to do that differently.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's such a hard problem, but I think with the ecosystem that we have here and that we collectively are trying to build, I think we've got a shot.
Yeah.
The next decade will be very exciting. So with that, maybe let's go to questions. So one of the questions, a lot of the questions were around the area of digital therapeutics, and this is probably a natural question for Amy, but other people should feel free to chime in. So so how does the FDA evaluate lifestyle interventions and digital therapeutics as a prescription category? And I think this is especially interesting because we're talking a lot about what happens after you have a disease. But a lot of these things are for pre-diabetes or for basically prevention as a new type of healthcare.
And importantly, this is still also being sorted out. So our ability to regulate this space is also a part of understanding how this space is changing and making sure the regulatory pathways are also able to accommodate the fact that this looks very different than standard devices and looks very different than standard drugs. So we have a series of pathways in development. One example is the pre-certification pathway, which is really a pilot asking the question, can we understand how companies are basically following good software practice, how we can monitor and understand how they're developing their software and their solutions, and then also understand performance across time. And so, right now, this is a book of work being run out of our devices center. And I think the main thing that I would say here is that it's important that we develop regulatory pathways that align with how this space is moving, but we also have to make sure that we protect and promote public health, and we also make sure that innovation can happen without getting in the way of public safety.
So can I just add on to that and coming
Please.
back to the very first question that you asked me, which is what can the FDA do to really help? I think the pre-certification path for software and devices and some of the newer regulations that are coming up regarding AI-enabled software are really powerful because they help certify a process rather than just an entity, which is a drug or a particular software version of a device. I think that is necessarily what one needs to do when you're doing cell therapy, because every cell therapy, especially if it's an autologous cell therapy, is different. And so you have to certify the process. So as we think about moving closer and closer to a world of personalized medicine, where you're going to be giving maybe individual patients or smaller groups of, really small groups of patients, a particular combination of drugs or something that is really targeted to them, certifying the process rather than I'm now going to force you to run a full-blown clinical trial for 5 people, I think that would be a really incredible way of allowing that world of personalized therapies, whatever those forms they might take, to come into being.
So I can't tell you what those pathways will exactly look like, but I think you're signifying important things. One is, as we get to places where we have really, really restricted indications, personalized, individualized therapies, 3D printed. I mean, like that's what we're already seeing right now, for example. We need to make sure that the pathways align with what those solutions are that are coming to the market or potentially could come to the market. Second is process matters a lot. And the third is ultimately, we're going to have to make sure that not only there's a regulatory clarity, but also we develop the flexibility that goes along with this.
So I want to squeeze in a few more questions. This one actually is a great one. So Daphne, you might be a natural person to start with. So, okay, so we've talked about data, but what about the next frontier of drug discovery? Like, what are you going to do with all that data?
Well, so I think...
and what's special? Yeah.
So we've started to hint at that in the context of really using the data to guide a particular therapeutic development that is targeted at very specific patient populations and in a way that isn't driven by hypotheses. I mean, it's kind of shocking when you look at the history of drug discovery to think about how many of those were how many of the failures that we've had have arisen from people coming in with a preconceived hypothesis about, oh, I'm pretty sure that this gene that I discovered is having some effect in a mouse or a zebrafish is going to work in a human. Well, you know, the thing about mice is that they're mice. They're not actually human. And there's a lot of things that just are not going to translate over, whereas we now finally have the ability to get access to large amounts of human data and align it with experimental systems that are human-derived systems in the lab, and you no longer have to do all of your experiments in mice or zebrafish. And so I think that's going to be the next discovery, the next path towards drug discovery, is really using the data to define to give us the next set of hypotheses that are not derived, that are derived directly from the data and what actually works in people.
Okay, so let me move on. Okay, I'll move on. So this one's also very poignant today. So, and I think everyone on the panel could probably touch on this in different ways. So what safeguards are needed to prevent the next opioid epidemic? You know, that's a case of misaligned incentives between provider, pharma, patients, and so on. What can we do?
I think that's you, yeah.
I think all of us in this country are really distressed by what's happened in the opioid space, in the opioid epidemic. There are a number of things that we can do. So first of all, within the context of our prescribing practice, making sure that, you know, while we adequately take care of patients in pain, we're limiting our opioid prescriptions, that we're not giving 30 pills when 30 pills aren't necessary. So there's a book of work that's got to do within the aspect of prescribing. There's a book of work that's got to do within the context or the aspect of understanding how to take care of addiction. And we have a lot of work to understand addiction in this country, and you know, the different mechanisms to take care of addiction. I think there's a book of work that's got to do with the social side of understanding how addiction affects communities and what does that look like. And certainly there's a book of work that's got to do with essentially pharmacological management within this space, including both management of pain with new pharmacological interventions or even device interventions, as well as pharmacological management of addiction.
I think there's also the fact that it's important to remove some of the stigma around addiction and also around psychiatric diseases more broadly, and come to the recognition that this is actually a disease and as such could be managed as a disease as opposed to some choice that a person makes to become an addict. And the fact of the matter is that you have people who are prescribed opioids and they take them for a few weeks when they need it, and then they go off and they don't even feel the urge. And then you have people who are, after 3 days, are addicted. And there's clearly a strong genetic basis for that. There's been demonstrations of heritability. So if we think about this as a disease and start managing towards that, and think about the person coming in as a patient, and different patients require different treatments. Right now, there's a lot of people who come into this with very strong, deeply held beliefs that if you're a drug addict, the only way to get around this is via a 12-step program. Well, that might work great for some people, but that might not be the best solution for others. And so thinking about this from the perspective of a scientific basis, I think would be hugely helpful to treat this.
Have we addressed the incentives issue? I mean, in terms of potential misaligned incentives between pharma payers and providers?
I think a lot of times, right, the payers who are the ones obviously footing the bill for not just the prescription drugs themselves, but also the outcomes associated with it. They don't have a lot of information, right? They're piecing together a lot of information. You got to question how good their systems are. So I think part of this goes back to the whole data problem we were talking about earlier, right? If we have data on patients that we can aggregate and look at and analyze in a right way, I'll tell you right now, our conversations with insurance companies, they want to know all this information. They just don't. They really, really don't, unless it's a very tight, closed system. And so a lot of this goes back to how do we collect this information? How do we give it to the right people? How can they analyze it? And then we start holding people accountable for the outcomes associated with that. We keep talking about outcomes-based medicine. We're talking about that for 15 years, right? You got to be able to do that when it comes to things like opioids and addiction.
Okay, so Amy, you got like 30 seconds with a very, very difficult question. So why not since we talked about alignment of patients, why not let a patient's to make more of their own risk assessments for drugs and interventions. Do we really need the FDA to dictate this 100%? Like, let's say you have a cancer patient. Why not empower them to and have the FDA pull back?
It's a really interesting question. You know, I think that as we've looked at everything from compassionate use to right to try, people who are very sick and in very devastating scenarios have asked oftentimes, why can't I just have access? And at least as FDA, especially through compassionate use, we've really tried to make sure that there are very clear mechanisms, not only for access, but also in a way that makes sure that it is aligned with your needs. And as a matter of fact, we even now have essentially a concierge model to try and improve on that. Ultimately, there's some basics that need to be taken care of, like massive toxicity. This is not going to kill you tomorrow. And then after that, it needs to align with the scenario of your health. If you've got a little bit of arthritis, this probably is not the right pathway for you. If you're dying of terrible psoriatic arthritis with infections and a number of other things going on, this may be something that aligns with your illness right now.
So I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, and please thank the panel as well.